Sure. Kevin, do you know how to do that? He's on it. All right. Hi.
Hello. And I'm Brian.
Today's cage match is brought to you. No, I'm just kidding. All right. So this there was a canceled session, and we both have sessions that are later. Mine's tomorrow. I think yours is too, right?
They're at the same time. So again, you have to choose.
Cage
your
match
love,
round
choose your
2.
love.
Okay. So talking with Avi yesterday, and he was like, "Hey, you and Brian are both here, and you kind of have different opinions on the whole component-based landscape in Drupal. Why don't you two have a panel and talk to humans about how you feel about things?" I said, "Okay." So here we are.
I also found out about the fact that I was participating in this via Nat mention on Twitter, which I thought was great yesterday. That was amazing.
Surprise.
No
He
better
was
way to
voluntold.
do it.
Cool. So I'm Adam. I am the VP of Engineering at Hook 42.
And I'm Brian. I'm an interactive developer at HS2 Solutions.
Cool. And I think I would like to start by sharing some high-level things that I like to do with component-based Drupal. The name is kind of funky, right? But really, the whole space is around, having parts of a design split into patterns, having that represented as a content structure in Drupal and things like that, right? Made very popular by a dude named Brad Frost, who wrote a book called Atomic Design, where it uses the dry principles. Don't repeat yourself. You have smaller bits that are reused in larger bits, and before you know it, you have a whole page, right? So there's a lot of uniformity, a lot of consistency, and as engineers, we are always advocating for reusability and things like that, so everyone's happy. So this is a very, very exciting space right now, in my opinion. I think you would agree.
Definitely.
There are countless solutions that are coming up. There's things that are in core. There's things that are contributed. A lot of people have different opinions about this. So I think that's really what we're aiming to do, is to share some different perspectives or tools or things or approaches. And this isn't a one-size-fits-all. So you're not going to, hopefully you won't leave here and say like, oh, we must do things this way. That's not the point. I think it's just more informational. And we actually both have different strategies that we respectively like to do.
Yeah, yes, some things in common, but definitely some different preferences as well. Yeah.
Bingo. So I wrote a blog post that is on one of his tabs, called Exploring Simplicity in Drupal Design Components. So this was written a while ago, over 6 months ago, something like that. So basically, I outline some goals. I outline an approach. I talk about the challenges to the approach, limitations, but I want to summarize that right now to get this conversation started. And then I think Brian can chime in on where some of his experience overlaps and differs at that point. So the first thing I would say is, for enterprise sites, you're often working with clients that don't just have one web property, right? Would you agree? So if you have more than one site, many of the solutions that are in the community right now, like there's Emulsify and I forget, there's like 6 or 7 more.
Gesso, I think, is one, but Emulsify seems to be the one that is gaining the most steam at the moment.
Shyla, I think, was an old one that used to do this type of thing. But they are basic, those solutions advocate for design libraries within a Drupal theme, okay? My preferred solution is building design libraries completely decoupled from a Drupal site. Having it sit in its own place and be its own thing, and then having Drupal be able to pull from it and use it and make it work. One of my main goals is, when writing this, is to keep it as simple as humanly possible. I don't want any extra tools at all. I want to make use of everything that's in core as much as possible, and not anything that's in contrib if I can avoid it. So one of the preferences there that a lot of people, we talked about the data structures in Drupal, right? If you have a pattern that's in design, in Pattern Lab, that might map to, let's say, a paragraph in Drupal, or it might map to a content type display or something like that, right? But paragraphs is contributed. That's a contributed module. So one of the things that I generally prefer is to try to find ways that you don't need to introduce that. And using a tool in core called custom block types allows you to avoid using something like paragraphs that has nearly 95% of the feature parity that you can get to have things that are more component-based data structures on the site. And core, very recently, even after this article, when I wrote this article, I was participating a little bit with the what was called the Place Block initiative in core in Drupal 8, but that was deprecated in favor of the layout builder that was just released in the latest version of Drupal core, very, very, very recently. So layout builder now is in core and allows you to place things like blocks and paragraphs and whatever you want on a page.
And, and the one thing I'd say about that layout builder, I think, is still experimental, right?
Still experimental, yep. But definitely now that it's been launched as part of this part of core, this the last release, it's actually in much better standing now and will hopefully mature and become.
And definitely the path forward. Just even from personal experience, I always try to remember and remind this is an experimental module.
Yeah, so it may change, but actually I feel that it's definitely the path forward. So that's the way that I've been looking at this. So to summarize basically what I did is I made sure that the pattern library that I was building was outside of Drupal 100%. I wired it in with Composer. I used Drupal's caching system to bring in all the assets that I wanted, CSS, twig files, you name it. And basically, I talk about how all the things come together. Cool.
Yeah, so based on that, I mean, there's obviously a lot that I follow in my process that's similar, and a lot of things that I agree with. But in following this process for the past, I'd say, couple years at this point, some things on projects that I've done differently. So, for example, you mentioned the idea of having your pattern library be an external dependency to your Drupal theme. I agree 100% that is the right way to do things, especially if your pattern library is going to be consumed by something else, or maybe you don't know it now and it will be in the future. But there also have been cases, even with that in mind, that I haven't taken that approach. And it's a little bit less with that, but kind of it goes to a bigger theme with this component-based approach for me on client projects is trying to make it so that it's easy for people who aren't familiar with this approach to integrate into it and be productive in it. So for something like having the pattern library be an external dependency of the theme, especially kind of earlier on in this approach, it was a little bit harder for people to wrap their heads around. Maybe people who weren't as familiar with composer-based workflows. I think that's becoming more common, so I think it'll be less of an issue. But that's one situation where, if we don't believe that the pattern library is going to be used outside of this application, it reduces some of the friction. I also definitely agree with the intent behind trying to use as much of what core offers as possible, and also with the layout initiative. I think those who are doing component-based theming should be hands-on with that functionality early, so that they can figure out how does their approach to component-based Drupal fit into that functionality. Are the things that we need to be able to make use of that better. But there are definitely cases where there are contrib things that I commonly use as part of this process. Paragraphs is one of them. And it's mostly just because I and others that I work with like paragraphs and are just familiar with the paragraph approach. It's not necessarily because it's the answer for a component-based approach to Drupal. And then also, kind of falling into the same category, another thing that I have used and follow along with pretty closely is the UI patterns module. And we haven't really gotten into the nuts and bolts of how this approach works, so I won't go too deep into it in case we do. But so that provides, it's a module that kind of helps take your components that are in your pattern library and the mappings that you might have into those pattern library components and make Drupal aware of them. It's essentially like a Drupal-friendly version of the component integration. And the biggest thing that I find very attractive about that is I think it helps simplify or makes potentially the process, in some cases, some more understandable or easier for other developers, especially back-end developers who might be integrating into the front-end components. Because another thing that I've run into with this process is, especially for developers who aren't familiar with it or back-end developers, there have been some challenges trying to integrate into the components that we've built. So I've definitely been focusing on trying to find ways to make that process easier to understand, but at the most, consistent. Because there's a lot of different ways to do this, and I think as a community we've kind of been figuring it out. So it's also really important that we land on something pretty consistent.
One thing about, I think that's important about the UI patterns module is it does tend to move things more into the site building realm, in my opinion.
Yep.
Because then the patterns that are registered in UI patterns tend to be able to be reused as displays for content types or for views or for blocks. Like it's basically kind of gets its tentacles into all the other parts of the Drupal system and can use patterns in that regard. For me personally, when I was exploring this, I'm very comfortable coding, both in Twig and
humble brag.
And I'm comfortable. I didn't say I was good at it. I said I was comfortable. All right. You're going to get the elbow. All right. So, but that's just from my perspective. One challenge, though, that I've heard, and I think that UI patterns has a good place for this, is around data processing. So I was in I think it was the Lullabot or the Palantir presentation last year here at MidCamp on design libraries. And it was a lot of pre-processing functions in Drupal and aggregating and throwing data. I actually never needed to do that because I was comfortable using Twig functions or using, changing how the data was being rendered through the user interface. But for more advanced cases where you have to do some processing, something like this would be very programming heavy. Right?
So let's maybe talk about that at a high level. I was told to not let this happen, and
Kevin
I blew it.
Come after you. You'll have two of us coming after you now, not one.
In a typical presentation, I'd be concerned that maybe stop the video, but it's just this,
right.
So we're fine.
It's a beautiful looking web page.
It's really
isn't
nice.
it? The font's like size 10
Look at that
font.
logo.
Right.
We can also jump over.
I hear there's stickers too.
We can have some variety and go back to this. But anyway, and I can dig up some slides maybe also if it would help with this concept. I guess here, even before I do this, let's just take a quick poll. So who has done what they consider to be taken a component-based approach to developing or theming in Drupal 8? Show of hands. Very small amount of people. Okay, cool. All right, so let me talk at a high level about like what the common approach might be. I'm actually gonna. Cool if I try to bring up slides for this. I'm gonna do that. I think I have an example somewhere here.
I think if you all can't tell, it really depends a lot on the comfort level of your team and what you want to be doing. There's a couple other contributed modules I wanted to talk about while he's pulling up the slides. The one is ironically called the Components module in Drupal, which is written by John Albin and allows you to do includes inside of Twig files. And so one of the beautiful things about that is you can have all your twig residing in Pattern Lab and reuse that or extend that twig inside of Drupal just by doing a mapping. Like include this twig file with this field value and this field value and this field value. And it's really elegant. So that's one I use. And I also use a module that I've written called block type templates. So it exposes a theme suggestion that allows you to make custom block types and then have one twig file for that block type.
Cool. Yeah, so just a quick high level of kind of what I consider to be the baseline component theming approach that takes the approach of mapping the data in the twig templates. So, and again, some of this is kind of my take on this, but so the idea is that in your pattern library, and not really focusing on any particular pattern library in this case, I do tend to use Pattern Lab, but there's a pattern library place where your component lives. And here in this card subdirectory, we're making a card component in Pattern Lab. The idea is that we're going to have all the pieces that we need to be able to render that component. So there's going to be a twig template for the markup. There's a markdown file to have some documentation that Pattern Lab recognizes. The JSON is some data that gets passed into our component in Pattern Lab. And then there's also a Sass partial that lives here. There might be some JavaScript that's particular to this component that will live here as well. But the idea is that in that one place, you have all the things that you need to render this wonderful card component.
I will state, too, that the use of Sass is completely optional. So this can be a raw CSS file, but I explained why I chose to use Sass in my approach inside of the blog post. The main takeaway is that it made it easier to glob all the files together, spit out one CSS file that was much easier to cache in Drupal. So, one line.
Yep. So, this is just a super quick look at what the structure of this markup might be. Here we have the base of the card with a number of divs that wrap the different elements of the component. We also see that there are some twig variables defined as well for things like the header, and the copy, and then the pieces of the image as well. And then I tend to follow a BEM naming convention for in my Sass. So that stands for a block element modifier. It's really just a way to kind of clearly define your Sass and CSS, and also prevent there from being issues with the cascade or your styles leaking out of that component. And it uses a particular naming convention there. You get usually some very specific classes out of that. So we have our card, and then there's our component in Pattern Lab, or your pattern library. The specifics don't matter quite as much. But we also need to make sure that the styles that we're using are imported into Pattern Lab and all that good stuff. So that the idea here is that the component that's rendered in your pattern library is the same thing that gets rendered into Drupal. So we have our card component that displays the way we want it to in Pattern Lab. People think it looks good. We have some ways that we're going to use it in our Drupal application, the website. So the next thing is, how are we going to map this, the Drupal data over into this component? How do we make Drupal aware of this component that we've built? So there's a handful of different ways to do this, but a simple example here is using a display mode. So there's a display mode for card when you want to display a card, a node in this card format. And the common approach here is that in the twig template, you perform some mappings. It's kind of like Drupal's template, this node cast card.html.twig here, kind of stands in the middle. And I think when this concept was kind of first discussed, it was described as a presenter template. But it sits in the middle, and it communicates and translates between Drupal and your component in your pattern library.
you could see that's referenced because this is pulling from the molecules, which is one of the orders of the hierarchy in the pattern, in the design library.
Yep. And that at molecules there is from the components module that lets you define a twig namespace. So it's just a little shortcut. But also that is necessary to get Drupal to look outside of your theme for templates.
One comment too, this is the mapping that I was talking about. This is an example of that. But this data is hard-coded. These can be twig variables, like card.title and card.description, right? And to go back to the custom block types example.
So that's what it would look like if they were variables.
Ah, cool. See, you're way ahead of me. Thanks, Brian. So the cool thing though is if you suppose you wanted to use a card in any part of the site and you wanted to integrate it with Layout Builder, this would be a really great example for using a custom block type, where you would say, I need a new custom block type called a card. The card is going to have, or the custom block type will have an image, a title, a description, right? And then you would use one twig file that did the mapping inside of that and bring CSS over.
I'm especially glad that I got to use completely out of context an image of Julie from Real World Season 1 here. So, and that made it into the video. So yeah, one thing that sometimes I find helps, especially when you're getting used to this process and doing it for the first time, is literally just getting a representation of the component from your pattern library just to show up in Drupal and passing in the placeholder data. And then you start to slot in the Drupal stuff. So in some cases, those mappings are pretty simple, like content.body for the copy here, or label for the header, which is actually the title, which is not as obvious. Thank you, Drupal, but still in the right neighborhood. But then we've got stuff like the component as defined had a variable for the source for the image and a variable for the alt text. So getting at that can require some gymnastics, getting the right URL, and then getting the right portion of the render array for the alt tags. So, as you do that more, you become familiar with how you can debug. I have some slides on that too if we want to get to it. But so you learn that, but there definitely is some resistance to try and figure that out. And the more complicated your component is, if you have things like rendered entities inside of it, it can be challenging to do that. And that, for me, has been where I've seen some of the pain when we've done this on client projects working with a larger team, especially back-end developers who see these components and are like, great, I just want to use it. Just let me use it. I just want to use it. I don't need you. I just want to use it. Which is what, ideally, you want to get to, lowering the resistance to being able to consume those things. But I have seen challenges with people being able to wrap their heads around this mapping process.
I will also say one thing too, because this is a great slide. Like this file URL is known as a twig function. So these are processors that are built directly into Twig. And Drupal, the Drupal theming system, has tons of them out of the box, or ones that they've enabled from the higher order Twig project, right? One of the things that I learned, and probably didn't make it into the blog post because it was already like 19 pages long, is that you should always be doing as much as possible, as much processing as possible in Drupal itself. Like if you try to put that back into the pattern library and move Twig functions around, that gets really gnarly really quick. So I would try to keep as much Twig processing and back-end Drupal processing in the Drupal space, and try to minimize the use of Twig functions unless if they're custom.
Can you give a quick example of that?
File URL. So like this content field image this is an image field in Drupal that requires this whole gobbledygook thing to be processed as an actual URL that gets passed to this Twig file. In Pattern Lab, instead of doing something funky like this, just pass a URL in your pattern library, because then you basically don't have to worry about any of the processing. You can let Drupal do the processing. And I feel like that's best practice because another system might have different processing that it wants to use. So, in my mind, I think it's more simple. Sorry,
So in this example, you'd use a preprocessor to put that URL into a variable.
So Twig has a bunch of processors already out of the box that you can use, and some are specific to Drupal's theming system as well that they've provided.
However, I forget exactly what provides it, but there certain versions of Pattern Lab, for example, know how to handle those, and they basically just ignore them. They don't explode when they get a Drupal-specific function. So pre-processing is definitely one approach, and one thing that I've kind of been struggling with that pain point, I go back and forth on it, but where I'm at right now is also, so when I first started taking this approach, I can build my component that is exactly how I want it to be. It has the beautiful markup without a lot of the extra stuff that Drupal tends to add, which is great. But I think it's pretty easy to go overboard to try to get that perfect, beautiful thing. So sometimes I think it makes more sense to kind of allow for the possibility to kind of go with Drupal's flow. I'm still figuring out the right way to describe this, but take an image, for example. Drupal's really good at handling images, right? And it's going to spit out image markup that's going to give you an image. That's Drupal's image and what you want. So rather than having an image tag that has two variables, what if the variable is actually just the image, right?
Or the markup, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Drupal is going to pass its representation of an image, the markup for an image. Maybe you could streamline it a little bit. Maybe there's a wrapping div that you don't want. But it saves you the pre-processing. It saves you some headaches.
Probably the alt tags as well, and
Yep.
things like that you wouldn't have to map.
Exactly, and it's not incompatible with using it with another application because it's just a placeholder for that image markup, and that other application will send its image markup, which is maybe a little bit different, but it's still an image. So ask yourself what you're really gaining by getting that perfect markup, is what I'd say.
There were some other hands.
I had a similar question.
Okay, so
It seemed like where you were going was that you would modify the file URL to display as a URL in the content.
yeah, like Pattern Lab would have basically like the URL representation. This ugly thing probably returns some file ID or something to that effect, or some file handle, and this gets rendered as a URL through its processing in Twig, right? But the pattern library is expecting a URL on the other end. And
Yeah, if you tried to dig in and get like the raw value here, it's probably going to be an impartial path to like public or
file
Oh, so keep-
//
So keeping this in the Twig file in the Drupal theme, even though you're sending the value to
Pattern Lab,
Pattern
pattern
Lab.
library.
Okay.
Yeah, and you have to
were
do
saying
that.
to get it out of there.
No, like you actually have to do that because Drupal has all of its own Twig naming that it expects for all of its different data structures, content types, blocks, taxon, I don't know, everything, right? So all the Twig suggestions, the naming suggestions, will pass Drupal's data into its own Twig file that you then have to do something like an include. But the beautiful thing about it is you could include this same card Twig 90 times if you wanted to. You can reuse it as much as you want. So in any Drupal representation.
I had two things. One, do either of you guys have feelings about
We have feelings.
I do.
Lots of feelings.
I know. The contrib modules that provide the extra Twig, either filters or functions. There's like Twig tweak, Twig field value. Sometimes I've found that they can help like do some of this translating, but other times I've heard people say like it's just too much.
I've used
things.
both of them, especially Twig field value, which you actually recommended to me, so thank you, and got some great use out of it. But I have found that a lot of times when I'm using, if I find myself using it a lot, things are probably too complicated, and we've probably gone somewhere dark.
Yeah, and honestly, I feel like that's the juggling act with all of this, is to try to keep it simple requires like a lot of kind of thought around, do I want to render separate image fields? Do I want to render one image? Like there's a lot of like kind of thought that goes on. And I wrote about this in the blog post a little bit, where I talked about that when I initially just put together the design library, right? Said, I'm going to move this to Drupal. No. When I started doing Drupal, I realized, oh, I forgot an alt tag. Okay, so I'm going back to the design library, fixing that, doing another release of the design library, mapping that in Composer, bringing it down, and then, so there was a lot of back and forth for me. And I think like you would almost expect that with technology teams, right? That you would want to collaborate between an enterprise Drupal build and an enterprise pattern library. So I kind of felt like that was expected, but at the same time, my first attempt at just doing I'm going to build this and then I'm going to integrate this was not accurate, and I don't think that's realistic.
But also just in general, being able to build those things in isolation without having to involve Drupal is really freeing, obviously.
There are some, platform limitations, right? Like if you do, Pattern Lab, you have to pick the Twig engine, right? If you have an enterprise system that's not using Twig, it's probably not going to be able to use it unless if you have some way to convert the Twig to Mustache or to Handlebars or some other fancy framework.
There are versions of Pattern Lab for many of those templating engines.
True, but you would have to copy or reuse the engine, right? Yeah. So,
The code's not reusable.
bingo.
Yeah, right.
It's actually a can of worms I'm curious about personally. So I have a pretty strong interest in how to look at the way that we can approach not just pattern libraries, but also templating in general across the client-server divide. There's Twig.js available, of course, but that's very distant from Drupal's own native implementation of Twig. Do you have any thought, because I've seen a lot of people increasingly use Pattern Lab with React or Pattern Lab with Angular. What are your thoughts on kind of the capacity for Drupal to be able to do client-side Twig or client-side templating with Pattern Lab and Twig?
I want to take it a step higher, and you might not like me for doing this. Where I see the biggest potential in that space is by using a task manager, like NPM or something like that, where you would build these tools that would be capable of taking one input and making a different output, right? Like these converters, these processors, and things like that. And the beauty of that is it would be built in natively through a workflow. So it would be wired in with DevOps. You could just say okay, the minute I deploy this, I want to run these 5 tasks, just like you run drush commands in Drupal, right? But I see that actually happening in the front end that's agnostic to Drupal, and Drupal being a consumer of that. That's my vision for it, but Brian probably will tell me I'm crazy.
No, I don't really have an answer there, but there's a lot of really interesting thought going on around that topic. And just some other things that I've seen and experimented with that are in that same neighborhood, going the other way. So getting closer to something that's decoupled that talks to Drupal. So be it actually a decoupled application, but there's something that I saw recently that I haven't really had a ton of time to experiment with, but really kind of sparked some things in my mind. I forget even what it's called, but I think it might be like Twig GraphQL or something. It's a contributed module that was recently created. But it actually allows you in your Twig templates to write GraphQL to access the data in
Oh, yeah, I've seen this.
So I'm by no means saying that that's the way things would go, but I do think we're at a point where really fundamentally rethinking how the front end works or how these pieces talk to each other.
I think the game changer for me is web components. True web components, not we're talking Drupal components, the actual
No, that guy agrees with you.
HTML spec called web components. And the reasoning for that is you will have guaranteed parity between your pattern library, your Drupal, your this, your that, and all it does is basically render the same markup in the same standard format that is becoming adopted. More browsers are supporting it now. Yeah, I know you're on the ball with all that. Yeah, so you should be up here talking about it. But that's where I see a lot of this stuff going, and I could totally see how something like Twig is almost deprecated in favor of a reference to a web component that lives completely outside of everything, right? Or is the design library itself.
I don't know if you, Preston, are involved in the talk, but there's a talk in Nashville.
Yes.
Kind of about that with a very
Provocative title.
There, that's
Yes,
what I was going for.
That is my title.
Preston will now be inviting Brian and Adam to
Yes.
his fancy talk at DrupalCon Nashville.
You're all very welcome as well.
Yeah, it's a really, if you're going to Nashville, it seems like a really interesting topic to check that out, but really kind of, let me know if I'm misrepresenting it, but kind of like a blue sky kind of look about how this could change.
I do see one thing that I'm probably getting off of the island a little bit here, but I really see Drupal moving way more into its content store capabilities and its workflow capabilities as a business system, like a BPM system with its workflow and its moderation. And I see the need to be separating that a lot from the actual display and the rendering. So all the initiatives around, providing like a more modern JavaScript framework for core is a very relevant discussion, and will probably further the separation or the decoupling of Drupal being everything, right? I'm going to render, I'm going to display, I'm going to store, I'm going to do everything all at once. So I do feel, though, that Drupal is a phenomenal tool at creating very good, discrete data structures that have, that are not WYSIWYG everywhere, right? Like, someone was talking to me earlier about the Gutenberg work, that WordPress is doing, where they're trying to do components inside of a WYSIWYG. I'm like, please, God, no. Like, computer science,
It's like short codes all over again.
Yeah, I just can't. I can't handle it. Like, it's
But really, to that, I'll just plug my talk tomorrow at 2:45.
Mhm.
Right? It's on a decoupled Drupal and React project that I worked on. So if you're interested in that sort of stuff, check it out. I don't know. If we just want to keep talking on kind of this general topic, I can show quickly the concept of UI patterns if people are interested in that. But we can kind of go wherever anybody wants to go.
Yeah, does anyone have questions at this point? We weren't prepared. This is like, you're seeing it live, folks, okay? So what questions or comments or considerations are you all curious about? Yeah.
I'm familiar with the including, and I like the tip about the module, the components module to help include stuff outside
Yeah.
of the theme. How are you supporting the CSS and JavaScript files from those components?
From Pattern Lab?
Yeah.
So I talked about it in my blog post, but basically what I do is when I reference the decoupled library in Composer, it brings it into the vendor directory, just like every one of Drupal's other, crazy Symfony stuff, the Twig stuff, everything is in the same vendor directory. All of that information gets referenced in the theme through its relative path and subsequently cached, just like it would be in the theme, except it's fully decoupled.
So that's definitely a common approach. It's part of the build process. As the guy who always finds ways to talk about the UI patterns module, even without the context of what that does, one of the cool things that it does when you make Drupal aware of your components through the UI patterns module, you can define libraries. So your component may have a library that it creates on the fly, or it can reference other libraries. So that's another way, if you're taking that approach and using UI patterns, that you can tell Drupal to go use those assets.
So you're committing the pattern lab to a module or to a space of its own, and then referencing that in Composer.
Yeah, they're two separate repos.
Okay.
Completely. If anybody, my personal site is still not done yet. I am shameful. If anybody would like to sprint on it and just wants to get some hands-on experience doing this, I am more than happy to sit down with you on Sunday and get the tools installed for you, and you could get some quick and dirty experience. What other questions are up? Yeah.
So I don't really work on the theme side, but I do pattern lab and Twig stuff. that's kind of absorbed by our development team. I'm wondering, like, how complicated does this sort of mapping get? Because this is a fairly simple component, and just from looking at this, you could include, your image could be an image atom, your heading could be a heading atom, and then just expanding that up, you could have something like this with a title, a description, 3 cards, and some other component you've already made. When you build those like bigger organisms, are you referencing, like, how are you managing those references? Because it would be referencing a twig pattern, and it would also be referencing a Drupal.
That's a wonderful question.
Okay.
So, all right, so I want to take a quick step back and say, in my opinion, and I'll probably get roasted for this, I come from like seeing the worst case scenarios that can happen in projects and things like that, right? I decouple the patterns as much as possible, like literally down to the most finite of discrete things that you possibly can do. I do that, and I haven't regretted it yet. What I will say, but you bring up a really, really cool point around like how do the patterns actually become reusable, right? So in Pattern Lab, every time that you have an organism or a molecule or a page, right, it's reusing, it's referencing, it's using the exact same stuff that is in the markup. Like it's using, at include atom card or atom title or atom image, right? And so all of that works natively in Drupal though when you do the same thing with the components module. So it's using the exact same including and syntax and things so that it keeps it and preserves it.
Well, I got potentially a couple of other things out of that. One is just the complexity of it all, maybe, but also were you asking like if you have a component that has a component inside of it, how does that all shake out? And how that works is that it actually just kind of all gets passed down. Yeah. So all those variables are available to their children. And I think the way that it actually works in the Twig world is that it's kind of actually building this large template-like thing.
So it's not actually reusing whatever you call this node dash card, whatever. It's making a whole new template that's referencing card and then putting a new name on that.
At the end of the day, how Twig actually renders that, I don't know the answer. But it actually goes and looks at that thing, and it takes all the markup and uses it.
And I did have one other comment about reducing complexity. You don't have to use you're not obligated to use the patterns from Pattern Library or from Pattern Lab. Let me give you a great example of when you wouldn't use one. You would never pull in a page template. Drupal renders many, many, many different things on a page, right? The header, the footer, blocks, the content, right? You would never bring in a Twig file that has, from Pattern Lab, which like a page example might have 30 or 40 includes. You would never, 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 never use that in Drupal because it has way too much stuff that it's doing, right? So it's just not feasible, right? And so one of the things that I ended up having to do because I didn't bring over the page level things is I did have a very small amount of duplication for some of the very high order Drupal templates, like the header and the footer and the main markup and some of the rendering of So the highest order ones I would not touch, and it's also up to you about what mappings you want to use. You don't have to use an organism. You could go straight down to an atom and reference that in Drupal if you wanted.
I find personally that the lowest level items and the highest level items are often the reward for splitting those out is sometimes not worth it for me, and it's the stuff in the middle where I get the biggest bang for my buck.
And that is, I think that's sage advice. What time does this wrap?
1 minute. Oh, 15 minutes?
15 minutes.
Oh, great.
Cool. More questions, comments?
I was going to make a statement about caching.
Yes, do that, and then I'll use that as my segue into maybe showing some UI patterns.
Okay.
But what's your experience with that? Because that is good advice.
So I have had experience, and I've been through this. So if you're using a pattern like this, in my experience, if you're doing something like this with a Drupal component, Drupal thing that's at the block level, you need to make sure that Drupal knows that it's a thing. If you are not rendering the content, the twig like content variable itself, then Drupal doesn't. That's like how Drupal knows that it's a thing that it should set a cache tag on. So, like with this code, for example, if this was at a block level, Drupal wouldn't know to like clearly cache if this block was updated.
Yep. One thing you can do is actually write a no display twig function where it would technically go through Drupal's rendering system, but not actually output it.
Right. So yeah, I did something similar where I just
Yep.
I used like twig set and just like set content render to a random variable that I didn't use anywhere, and and then the cache.
So by doing content.field name, you're not triggering the cache thing you're talking about.
Correct.
Yeah, you're not rendering it. There was a really good blog post that was going around recently from one of the folks at Media Current, I believe. Can't remember what the title was, but it was a using Drupal with components based post, and he specifically goes into some of the strategies to working around that.
Yeah.
It was great, worth reading if you're into this stuff, for sure.
I also saw, I should mention this, that if anyone is curious about the actual discipline or the academics behind these concepts, there's a talk that was given in DrupalCamp Florida a couple weeks ago. I was there, by Derek Reese of Red Hat, and he talked about a lot about like the concepts or the methods of why things are the way they are in design systems and stuff like that. So that's also a really good foundational thing to study if you're curious.
So I'll use that as a segue into some of the UI pattern stuff real quickly. But so just to show an example of that. But so one of the benefits that you get from using a module like UI patterns that makes Drupal aware of these components in a Drupal way is that it does handle the caching. So it is in fact something that is going to help you work around that particular issue. I'll just super quickly just go through this just to show what this looks like, and then I'll shut up about it. So when you're using the UI patterns module, if you have a component, you have to use a YAML file and define your pattern, your component. I won't go into all the details of everything. I just want to show a real high-level basic example. But basically, you give it a machine name, and you define all of the different fields. And then, so it'll give you a default template suggestion there. But you can also alternatively say with this use statement to just go and use the template in your pattern library. And you don't have to have that middle presenter template in Drupal at all. And then it's going to give you, it has like a default like pattern lab light-like module that you can enable. So it'll show you your component in Drupal, all the fields and all that good stuff. And I'll skip over this. There is some complexity in configuring this, but just getting to the meat of it, what that then lets you do is so this is using field layout. You have to have some sort of module enabled that lets you handle layout. So field layout or display suite would be another option. But if that's exposed, you can select your pattern from the list. And then once you do that, in the field UI, you can actually pick your field and map it to the particular variable in the pattern that you've defined in Drupal. So really, this is just a Drupal UI-based approach to that sort of mapping that we looked at. So it does bring it into the realm of site builders. It solves some of those issues of your included twig templates. Like when you take the twig include or extends approach, it's really just a black box that Drupal doesn't know about. But now it knows about those things because you specifically told them through that YAML file what it is.
Actually, could you go back real quick too?
Yeah.
Like to the next one over. Yep. One more. Manage display. Where's that image?
Oh, you mean this?
One more. Whatever. Okay, so the managed display page, we talked about all the data parsing and things like that. Yeah, like you can get up pretty far by just trying to dork with the settings and the formats and things like that. And honestly, if you want a good problem to solve, instead of writing your own custom parsers, if you feel like there's value, contribute it into the community. Like, someone else might want it. So then you actually have, done something that instead of people having to hack at it every single time, you give it back.
Consider that your stern talking to, folks.
By
Thanks,
someone
Dad.
who, yes.
But yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I just wanted to at least show that as an alternative. I think it's a really interesting approach to making Drupal aware of these things. It has its own complexities as well. There's certain, as far as knowing which kind of sub-modules of UI patterns you need to enable, there's other things you have to wrap your heads around as well.
One other kind of fun thing is view modes. So that's yet another Drupal wrapper around all of this that you can consider. If you have the same data structures and you want to display them in tens of different ways, like here's a full page view, here's a teaser view, here's a this view or that view, you can use view modes and basically have even another place to make modifications and variations to the same thing, and maybe even bring in a different template or have a different mapping or different values behind the scenes.
Yeah, there really are so many different ways at it in Drupal that it's kind of amazing, and also a challenge. It could be display modes, it could be blocks, it could be your content type, your entity.
Could even be a view.
Yep.
Like most of the work that I did with mine were views because I wanted to render a list of blog posts that I wrote or a list of social media icons that I wanted to display. Right? We're basically pulling in from some area, rendering it. And I would put all my pattern library stuff inside of a view-specific twig template. All right, so yeah,
Any other
questions?
questions around?
Have we bored you all to tears? Yes.
I have a question, only because I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. I haven't done any of this before. But basically your components are more or less referencing CSS selectors. Is that what you're doing?
Well, I think Brian, I don't know if it's in this slide deck, but
It's the other one.
when inside of the design library, there is a well-known structure, and it's self-contained. Every pattern is self-contained. So you build the markup, you use BEM, the BEM structure, which is just like a standard of naming CSS classes, of hierarchy of those CSS classes, and that applies. Yeah. So if you're using SCSS, you can see the syntax here, where I'm going to start at the highest order and then drill my way down of defining the different bits and pieces. So
like if you're not familiar with this sort of nesting and approach in Sass, like the class it's going to end up giving you is card __ image. And so that element in the markup right here, card __ image, you put that on the div, and it's going to give all the rules. Whoa, Nelly. all the rules that are included here just get applied to what's in this div.
and this is completely self-contained. So you talked about I think bringing them together, right? So like if you have a card that lives in a region, and the region might be like an organism or it might be a molecule depending on your hierarchy, but what you would do would be that in your organism, you would define the different logic that you want. So it's all self-contained. Every pattern has all of its own stuff.
It's a little bit of a tangent, but as I've been learning React and some of the approaches to styling in JavaScript, it's kind of interesting in that we're going through so much work with something like BEM and that sort of structure to kind of force it into being self-contained like that. And it is really interesting to take an approach to styling that actually is literally self-contained. There's a lot of ways in the JavaScript frameworks to make it so the styles literally can't leak out in any way.
But then, so for instance, in your card selector, you could be reusing the image or the header. So they could actually, you could be just referencing that once, but you could also reference that in other places? For instance, if you had a different selector, that would be?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But I would say that, you know, the intent behind this, I think, is that you don't.
Right.
And it would
Can.
result in there being potentially some duplication across your styles. And if that doesn't make sense to you, then maybe BEM isn't for you. But if you really want to reuse things broadly, then maybe that's not the way to go.
It sounded like an idea like you have an image field and you want to display that image in 3 different kinds of cards. You can do that.
Yeah, that's actually a really good example to bring up because, so this says card.twig, right? But you can have variations. So you could do card-blue or blue card, and it could be class card space blue, and you could have the same markup and just have a blue variation and a red variation that would probably get you the same.
Or better yet, you could have a variable that you pass into your twig template as a modifier.
Ooh.
He's smarter than me. This is why.
Sorry. I shouldn't have said better yet. I should have said or also.
Inception.
Yeah, the variable idea is definitely sexier.
That's what I bring. Sex appeal.
Any other questions, comments?
Was this useful and interesting to people, given that we pulled it out of our butts? Cool. Thanks.
You want to hit the red button so we can really have the talk?
Yes. Yeah, we can finally really have talk. We both have talks tomorrow, so
Oh,
go
yeah.
go to one of them or one of the other talks at that time because they're all great. And if you're going to the sprint, I have a component-based theme that I'm working on, or if you want to play around with the layout stuff in 8.5, that I'd be really interested in banging on that as well. So if you're at sprint, let's talk.
My talk tomorrow is on technical leadership, 2:45, same time as his, and I have Nerdstein stickers.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.